No more swears. Hi. Okay, great, everyone. Yes, so we will do exactly those things that Paul alludes to. We will tell you who we are and what on earth we're talking about. But before we do that, we want to kick off just with some thoughts from the audience around some of the principles we're going to explore. So just to kind of foreshadow where we're going, some of the thinking that John and I have been doing is around the kind of parallels that sit behind how game mechanics have emerged and around how teaching and learning kind of pedagogic thinking has developed and the ways that they grapple with very similar issues around user experience, engagement, learning curves, autonomy versus constraint, all of those kind of things. And that's the kind of thing we're going to delve into as we go into the presentation. But we wanted to kick off just by inviting, as it is a seminar, participants to start to think about how we can play with those concepts and where they break and where they're useful. So this is the task for you. We want you to have a think about a couple of games. Doesn't matter if you are an avid gamer, or I think we have a few people here who've gravitated from the Rise sphere rather than from the gaming sphere. It doesn't matter. You'll all have a kind of cultural anchor in how a computer game works. You'll have played one. What I'd like you to have a think about is the ways in which the mechanics of that game work, and fundamentally how it teaches the learner to behave, to act, to be able to do things in particular ways, and how it frames a journey or an experience towards that particular outcome. Then I'd like you to flip it and have a think about a lesson, a unit, a course, something you've studied, something you've delivered, and what that course might look like if you bolted those mechanics onto it. And it doesn't have to be better. In some ways, this task is easier if you do it. We do it worse. So I'll give you a bit of thinking time, but it's really helpful along the way if someone's got an example of this kind of thinking they could share. And given that I've given the introduction, I'm going to make John do it if none of you jump in, just to help the audience kind of get a bit of leverage on the task. So I don't know whether I'll give you a moment. If you could throw your hands up or just jump in. Everyone hates audience participation. And presume, go on. Oh, you've got something. I was going to pick on you. Go on.
I'm going to say you have incentives to reach the next level. So we kind of have these ideas about having something dangling in front of us that if you do these things, you get to the next stage, and then you've gathered those tools, or you've got something in your belt that means you're better.
Yep. Okay. And go on. Have you got more thoughts?
And are you going to ask me how that pins on to something learning? Maybe nothing specific, but in a kind of general way. Things around like assessment. So we give feedback and we constantly kind of support students who are going through a learning experience to feel like they are gathering skills. We give them feedback on those skills and then they can use them in the next stage.
Right, yeah, so there's the UX of accumulation and extrinsic motivation is what you're talking about there. And there's a whole slew of games that nag you to keep re-engaging with them for the sake of accumulating points or additional clothes or things that don't actually relate to the intrinsic satisfaction of playing. It is around the accumulation of those things, and of course we see that that all over the place. I have a 6-year-old son who is very, very invested in his star chart in reception at the moment, and he doesn't actually know why he's accumulating those stars or what for, but they're very, very important to him. Yeah, so I describe that as a mechanic that isn't about the learning; it's about the discipline and policing and the authority of the session rather than the act of learning. Yeah, okay, Mike has just contributed the dynamic of failure and iteration that sits behind things like Mario. those levels are set up to lead you to fail, to modify behaviors, to do things in a slightly different way. It's a more sophisticated adoption of the gaming hermeneutic than pure rewards, because there's something a bit more intrinsic there. There's a motivation around mastery and completion that isn't in the approach that Elle describes. Yeah, great. John, you riff on Jeff's while I read Laura's.
I mean, so Jess mentioned the old school Prince of Persia, which I do remember playing at some point, I think. And this idea that you the gradual build up of different ways of overcoming obstacles, repetition of those alongside new obstacles introduced, and having the timed element as a driver. And that, I think, actually is the repetition aspect is something that really speaks to me, especially about these kind of with regard to these kind of old school retro games, is that often you kind of encounter something and then encounter it again and then encounter it again in a new context, and it's about reconfiguring, often because of the limitations of the game engine. There's only so many sprites you can have, but reconfiguring the same things in different ways. But that idea about repetition has definitely got kind of it definitely matches up with school education in particular. I think you just call the sort of constant practice and repetition. Absolutely, yeah.
Right, and Laura is building, I think, a little bit on the kind of perspective that Elle had there about the way in which the in-game economy becomes the thing rather than the intrinsic link. Laura, I lost a very similar streak and over Christmas, and even worse, it was a thing that me and the 6-year-old did together, and we lost it because I forgot. Which I've got a feeling is a schism in the relationship that is never coming back. Good. Any reflections on Paul?
The example that's come to mind is Pokemon Go, and the mechanic being collecting Pokemon and an addiction, I suppose, because I think Pokemon trades on a sort of addictive mechanic and addictive behaviors. So I wonder, I mean, I've got my own thoughts about what a lesson or what sort of pedagogy around sort of Skinner box like minor rewards for almost no effort. But I wonder how I guess idle games or these kinds of games might be. How do you respond to those kinds of mechanics, which are very effective in some ways?
They are. I experience Pokemon Go in a slightly different way. But particularly in comparison to some of the more on rails type of experiences that we've alluded to. So Mario, Duolingo, all of the kinds of games that Elle was referring to. Your freedom on the landscape is pretty constrained. I think the mechanic of keeping you engaged, I think you're right, it's habit forming, isn't it? But it invites you to do something a little bit more autonomous, which is choose a direction, find a place, explore, adventure, find nooks. And I think some of the mechanic within that is as much, I found a thing that's in this space in my landscape that I didn't know was there.
Yeah, Charlotte had to start talking about roguelikes here. Charlotte's our resident expert in those. Might be an interesting way to map onto learning a situation. Oh, everyone's chatting now.
I'll do Daniel, you do Charlotte.
A situation which a player faces that challenge to a new situation when they either win or fail. With what players learners bring forward to a new situation is the knowledge they've learned in the previous situation, which they can apply to the new one. That's a really interesting conception, and it's something we're going to talk about a bit later on, actually. So thanks for that, Charlotte.
Yeah, good. And it describes a spiral curriculum. It describes something that is, I think it's a really interesting place, actually, to connect the two things around game design and pedagogy, because the thing that happens in those kind of game mechanics is old educational theory. It's 1970s Bruner spiral curriculum, introduce a concept, find sophistication in increasingly more complex spaces and avenues. So it's a really good space where I think the two things have a bit of synergy. So NetHack, do you want to have a look at Erica's? And I'll Erica's you might want to save a little bit because
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Daniel's describing a space where the limits to what is achievable by the player. It's an ultimate sandbox type experience where anything's possible, but almost what's guaranteed is that you're going to fail out of the back of it and come back and construct something new. So the hermeneutic becomes two things: how you generate new possibilities in the complexity, but also the ways in which the community becomes important in getting you ahead of the track, because it'll take you a long time to emulate the things that they've got. I think that describes a really adventurous educational landscape, and one that I'm not sure any of us have been brave enough to create, because what it does is it makes the rules very, very thin. There are a few basic principles, but the possibilities that can emerge within it are entirely open. But the communality is important.
Yeah.
We co-construct something together. It is never the product of an individual learner. It's the opposite of what we do in pretty much all education, which is atomized and individualized, and success can only be accounted by. And it actually tracks all the way through to our promotions in our highest educational things. You know, your professorial app is about your individual excellence, not something that's combined with others. John, did you have another reflection there?
No, I was just going to move on to Erica, but yeah, so Erica's starting to predict where we're going to go with our discussion of Breath of the Wild later on, so I'm not going to cover it too much. But I don't know if this makes sense. She says at the end, it does make sense, because we're going to make it make less sense, I think, now by talking about it. But this idea that Erica picks up on about starting with teaching the basic principles and learning how to learn. So giving you something to do and then an arena in which to apply it is something we're going to keep coming back to. So thanks for that. Yeah. Shall we make a start? Oh, I've accidentally moved a slide. I think so. Should we go for it?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the official start of the presentation, which is, as Paul already said, is called Plateaus, Towers and Shrines: Man Met Rises Open World Design Principles. I'm John, and my co-presenter is Mark, who you've already heard talking a bit. So Mark, do you want to say who you are?
Yeah. So hello, I'm Mark. I have a role in the university leading a strategic project within which directorship and academic leadership of Man Met Rise is one aspect of it. We'll tell you a bit about Man Met Rise in a minute. So I'll hand over to John again.
And I'm John. I'm really sorry I'm not smiling in my picture. I was trying to find a recent smiley picture, and I'm so haggard and tired from having a toddler that I don't have any. I'm a lecturer in education. My PhD was in kind of games design and education and the overlap between the two. And now I'm applying that stuff to the work we're doing on Rise. And I've said at the bottom there, just to give you a hint about kind of where we're overlapping in terms of our research interests. And this is definitely kind of practice-based research about what we're actually doing in terms of designing educational experiences. But we're kind of looking at the interaction between video games, higher education, and design, and the ways in which they overlap, but coming definitely from a non-technical perspective. Neither of us are games designers or particularly technical techie people, so we're trying to use kind of the philosophy of those things in our research, I guess. Yeah, so today we're going to talk a bit about what Rise is and what we do, and then we're going to introduce these sort of parallel metaphors of learning journeys and learning landscapes and how they link to open world games. And that leads into kind of a discussion about our design principles for Rise and where that leads in terms of next steps. But the big question is, what can the metaphor of open world, which we've borrowed from open world games, bring to education experiences in general, but specifically for us, it's about higher education experiences, obviously, because we're working at a university. So what is Rise? Mark, do you want to do this bit?
Yeah, okay. So Rise is, for those of you, I'll do it in the nutshell rather than the big story, because some of you will be bored to death of hearing of this, and some of you are like, what on earth is this? So Rise is an institutional co-curricular programme at Manchester Met. It is integrated into our curriculum framework, so it's accessible to all students in the university from level 3 through to PhD, and it encourages them to step out of their degrees and undertake experiential learning, which will support their employability in a really broad way. It lets them over-credit their degrees, so everything we do, they can write reflective pieces, which results in credits that count towards their degree in addition to their programme. It has all sorts going on. So it ranges from a language course to an international mobility. One day we'll do them again, to collaborative projects with other students across the university and with partners outside of that university. It has placements and internships. We do lots of stuff where we give students a basic new skill, and then we create a platform where they can apply it. And it is wildly popular with students. So just for a sense of scale, it has moved from a pilot year with a target of 300 students to its last year in which 10,000 students were engaged, which is about a quarter of the university's population. And already at this point, we're up to 5,000 students this year. It's really interesting in that it's engaging a really diverse range of students. We overrepresent BAME students, first generation students, commuting students, students with mental health declared issues, all groups who've conventionally universities struggle to engage in things like enrichment activities which sit outside of the curriculum. Students are there in abundance. And we see really interesting student behaviours within it. We see students doing things because they look hard or they look challenging. We see students very definitely taking kind of psychosocial risks in the things that they do. And the framing of what we do is all kind of part of that. So it's a really big open playground for educational experiences in a very broad sense. And we invite students to bespoke their experience and profile by engaging with it. Does that do as an intro, John?
I think so.
I missed anything. Yeah.
Oh, hang on, my screen's about to turn itself off. Oh, there we go. Right. So, Mark, you were going to talk through this one.
I'll talk to this one. Right. Okay. So, great big open platform in which we say to students, here are a load of things you could do. You can do anything you want with it. Go ahead, make the most of it. One of the things that becomes very apparent with that is it is an experience which is really alienating for students. They have spent their entire educational careers playing R-Type or Mario. They've been on a very tightly curated pathway journey through their educational experience, in which they have been buffered from learning outcome to learning outcome, from assessment to assessment, from qualification to qualification, from stage to stage, and what universities have had to do to respond to that culture, that habit that forms around that, is we've had to kind of continue it. So what universities have done in order to assure a good student experience is they've created more structure and scaffold around the student experience, to the point where your timetable is delivered to you on an app, so that you always know where your next thing is going to be. And that has had function. It helps students to navigate a new terrain, which is university, and particularly those students who maybe have not got any family history of higher education. That scaffold is helpful in helping to incorporate them into an unfamiliar space. At the same time, our view is that it has negative consequences when we then look at the other end, and we look at students and the demands around graduate outcomes and employment destinations. What that structure does is it takes away some of the agency that then we want to see when they come to apply for their graduate jobs. It also does things like it teaches them a very thin sense of their own self-value, because all their validation processes are in reference to that learning journey. And as a consequence of that, what you see is in our most in those group of students who we would identify as underemployed, your profile suggests you've done really well, but you're not sat in a graduate job. When you look at what those students are doing around their post-degree behaviours, they're applying for jobs and they're applying to be accountants. And they're saying, because I've got an accountancy degree. And when you dig at those students, they've got all sorts of other really valuable assets, experiences, and qualities that have never been validated along the journey because of the tightness of that structure and scaffold. So what it's doing is it's creating problems on two levels. It's creating problems in terms of plasticity, but it's also creating problems in terms of identity, particularly on those students who may have grappled with imposter syndromes all the way through. At the same time, dropping a student into a space where they have absolute agency, and in which you say to them, there are no right answers or wrong answers here. What matters most is the journey that you form through the opportunities we create. Whilst we want that to be a kindness, and while we want that to be a positive experience for students, they find it absolutely terrifying. So we're stuck with this core tension that on one hand, you need to present structure and scaffold in order to not alienate students from their opportunities. On the other hand, you need to create agency and space for emergence in that space in order to get them to the place that we want to do. So that notion of autonomy and student-centered journey is really critical to our impact. Okay, John.
Oops. Yeah, and that's kind of where games like it comes in, because we obviously approach this as a something to be designed, as an experience that we need to design for students, and given my history especially, we thought let's go to games to look at this. I mean, historically there is a huge link between games and learning, and it's well documented and well practiced, and there's an awful lot of literature out there, an awful lot of practice out there about people using games as tools for learning. Started out in schools, lots of universities now using it as well. But this idea that basically because games are engaging and because games are fun and because games actually do teach you stuff, you can actually take a game and use it in the classroom or use it in the lecture theatre or use it in the same way that you'd use any other learning activity. And at the same time, what we've got some of that stuff that we talked about at the very beginning, the gamification of university systems. So the use of game-like systems, especially points and missions and, you know, extrinsic reward for what should be intrinsically rewarding activities, giving people endorphin buzzes for completing streaks of activities and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of practice out there. What we wanted to look at instead, and what's kind of more of an emerging area where there's less stuff happening, is this idea about pedagogy as kind of user experience design. So you're kind of learning from the process of designing the game, as well as just, oh, games are good for learning, so we're going to use them. It's the design process that's really important there. Again, there's already practice out there, and universities tend to be following schools. So there's schools in America called Quest for Learn, which use in which the pedagogy is precisely designed to be game-like and precisely about kind of missions and acquiring skills so that you can complete the boss at the end of it and that kind of thing. And even further, kind of even more abstract level, the thing that really appeals to me is this idea of learning principles, which comes from James G, who does a lot of work on games and learning. And that's about kind of almost the power of metaphor. He basically says, okay, we know that people learn from games and that games are a really engaging way of learning, rather than just saying, okay, we'll use games in that case. Instead, look at games and understand what makes them so engaging and what makes them such powerful tools for learning, and try and apply that in the same way to non-game experiences. So we're not using games as a tool, but as a way to kind of understand learning in the first place, even when a game isn't actually involved. And what's really useful about that is that you don't need the technical expertise of Nintendo to create learning activities. What you need is the sort of imaginative power, or the ability to play with metaphors and the ability to think differently about things, rather than going straight to the coding and coming up with a game to solve this problem, basically. So that's kind of the root of a lot we're going to talk about today, is that we're speaking metaphorically about games, even games that are very real and doing real things in the real world.
Okay, great. So I'll pick this one up. So one of the things that we've done as we've tried to understand what we're doing with students better is tussled a bit with the language that we found ourselves gravitating to. One of which is central is the notion of the learning journey, and this is language that is really kind of ingrained into education, and we use it to proxy a sense of developmental changes that occur in the individual over time in response to an educational experience. So we've got a kind of a sense there that there is a journey happening in education. In HE, quite often what we do is we talk more broadly about the student journey, because that pathway isn't only the stuff that happens in classrooms and lectures, it's also a much broader experience of being at university. The thing that we've been grappling with is how much agency is bedded into that concept. The ways in which it's framed in culture in general, a journey is something that a person does. So agency is in there. You can't have the journey without the journey person exercising some free will and autonomy over the places that they go in order to reach a goal that's individually held. And that's a goal that might be mundane, it might be emergent, it might have serendipity, and it might be framed by external things, but ultimately it's the person who does that journey. When you reflect that back onto educational journeys, it feels less authentic. So you can't suggest that there aren't individuals with agency and purpose in our classrooms and lecture theatres and seminars, but that agency is really, really strongly framed. Almost to the extent that actually when we talk about the learning journey, we're doing it in really normative ways. We don't mean the thing that emerges out of the choices that an individual makes. What we're talking about in education when we talk about the learning journey is very often the journey between fixed points through a prescribed route, and often with predefined modes of travel within it. So what we want to then do is crack that open and think about, okay, what happens if you put more agency, emergence, serendipity into that articulation? I'm starting to think about it in terms of what happens if you turn that learning journey more into a sense of an adventure. And John, if you want to flip us on to the next slide. So where that took us next is that those journeys then, if they're being framed by something, it's by the educational landscape. And that landscape on which the journey takes place makes some things more or less available to the person, to the adventurer, to the person trying to navigate it. So we started to think about some of the kind of formal and informal ways that the framing of our student experience makes possible particular journeys and makes impossible other journeys. And actually the ways in which we can start to pull some of the structures out of that, but use the landscape to make it more navigable to the student. Do you want to do the next one, John?
Oops, here we go.
Okay. Skip through past this because I've kind of covered adventure. Yeah.
So when we started thinking about landscapes and the idea that a landscape might be constructed around a journey or to make particular journeys happen, that's where we went back to the game metaphor and started thinking about open world games. I was going to ask here, like, what is an open world game? But for the sake of time, I think we've all got experiences of them. I'm going to give you kind of our definition, and there's loads of definitions out there. But open world games are what are basically curated landscapes. That was the important thing for us, is that someone creates a landscape and puts things together in a particular way that make certain journeys more available than others, but also encourage exploration. So open world games are effectively designed for player agency, so that they're about freedom. They're about the player choosing what they want to do. They're non-linear often, so even if they've got a linear plot or a linear story, there'll be branches, there'll be areas in which you can go off and do your own thing and ignore the main story and all that kind of thing. They provide open space. That's why they're called open world. So they're often defined not just by the fact that there's freedom, but also that they're absolutely massive. So often they're absolutely huge. You'll get kind of discussion online about kind of the size of the map of this game and how long it would take to cross it in real life and that kind of thing. And they're all about that balance between narrative and freedom, which relates back to that tension that we talked about earlier on. That you'll have often have a game that wants to tell a story and that wants to get the player from the beginning of that story to the end of that story, but also wants to allow them to complete exploration. There's also some critical factors there as well. it could be argued now that open world games are completely ubiquitous. They are the main kind of format of a AAA title now. It will tend to be open world to some extent. It will tend to look like all the other open world games. They're very easy to get wrong. It's very easy to make a very boring open world game that doesn't really entertain the player or provide the player with much to do. And they're also produced increasingly through dubious practices. There's so much content in open world games that often there's crunch, and there's often, you then get the story of how this was made, and it turns out everyone who made it was exploited and underpaid and all those kinds of things. I just randomly typed in open world games and found some headlines online. So these are the sort of headlines you get in the games press online now about open world games. Open world games, the design's awful. Ubisoft, who are kind of the main makers of most of the open world games now, they get their maps are ranked by worst rather than best, because obviously they're bad. But also there's a sense of fatigue that people who play a lot of games get tired of open world games because there's so much out there and there's so much to do, and often you want a more curated experience. You want to be kind of players wouldn't mind if actually the game was a little bit smaller and told them what to do and maybe didn't just give them complete freedom. It's that same anxiety coming up again.
John, can I just riff on something there?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I'm butting in. So it makes me reflect on what you see quite often in early years practice. Those of you from a non-educational background, a non-teaching background. So the most exciting pedagogy, teaching and learning, you'll see anywhere in the country is in early years settings, in nurseries. In that kind of setting, you'll see really bad practice there, but the best practice you will find there, because there's a culture within early years practice of child initiated learning, of learning in which you follow the lines of inquiry that emerge from a little kid in a setting engaging with a stimulus. And it's really exciting. It's the kind of thing actually we're reaching for when we look at Rise, and I hold up on the pedestal as really good practice. But what you also find there is a real tension around the role of the adult, the curator, in that experience. And the nurseries you see that get it wrong, either too strongly frame their kids' experience, and actually what they're doing is they're just telling babies what to do. But at the other extreme, you get a very strange culture sometimes, which is we don't have anything to do here. We step back and we let the kid lead everything. And the trouble with that is a toddler is a toddler, which means their capacities are limited by the experiences that they get. And there's a need for a more experienced other to drop a stimulus into that space in order to open possibilities. And there's a very similar thing, I think, in what John is talking about here, about that tension between the curator and the openness. Sorry, John, I'll hand back to you.
As a solution to this, kind of out of nowhere, but our kind of provocation for both of us, because we both played this game. I think I mean, Mark's son has played it a lot as well. Breath of the Wild, which came out in 2017 from Nintendo, which is, I don't know how many other Zelda games have been, but it's in a long line. But the critical consensus around this, and I think the public consensus around this, is that they basically perfected the open world game, and they did it by not doing loads of things that other open world games do, and by making a game that actually is incredibly curated and within the genre of open world games isn't particularly open in certain ways. So that the process of how Nintendo went about curating that was something that really fascinated us. It provoked us. I mean, what I think is really interesting about Breath of the Wild is it has a really well documented design philosophy. So there's multiple ways of looking at this. But for instance, I put a link there to the 2017 Game Developers Conference talk that they gave, and these are some slides from that on the right hand side, where they basically went through exactly how they manipulate the player into doing this within the game. So using the landscape and using the context of the game to actually provide a non-alienating experience to the player. But it's also a design philosophy that becomes obvious to the player through play. Again, if you look at online chat about this game, everyone becomes a games designer by looking at this game, because they can understand not only what Nintendo have done, but how they've done it. Because it's obvious by looking at what they've done that they're doing that to you. It's a really open and clear design philosophy. which leads people to read the game as a kind of critique of the open world genre, and lots of talk after it came out was like, well, we're gonna have to stop doing this genre now. It's been done. They've done enough of it, and there's no point in making any more games like this because there'll only ever be kind of pale imitations of this. What we like though is that Breath of the Wild is an explicit learning experience, and we'll talk a bit about some of the factors that go into that in a second. But it does teach you how to play itself in a really amazing way, and in many ways that's Nintendo being Nintendo. All Nintendo games are like that. Nintendo, unlike other games developers, make games for people who don't already play games. So often the literacy of how do I actually jump, how do I move around this world, they don't take any of that stuff for granted. Unlike, you know, if you pick up a AAA title now, it'll often assume that you already know how to play it. Even if it does have a tutorial, it will just be, here's how your knowledge can be applied in this context. With all Nintendo games, but Breath of the Wild in particular, you can go in at a very base level and really understand how it's played because it teaches you how to play it. And what that basically did for us is by playing and reading Breath of the Wild, we kind of came up with our own design principles for Rise. And this is how you take what Nintendo did and apply it within a higher education context, I suppose. So one of the things we realized that we should be doing is not curating experiences, but curate the landscape and let the experiences take place within it. So that became a really guiding principles for them. And you can frame, but you don't dictate student experience. But what you do is by keeping the framing loose, but then providing some recommended tools to tighten it, you actually provide a lot of structure for students that doesn't look like structure, but feels freer. There's some examples of how we do that in a second. The other thing that we thought about is designing for multiple play styles. So this is the idea of student agency, that there are some students who will engage in our activities completely freely and really embrace it and want to roll up their sleeves and do whatever they want. There are some who want to follow a set pathway and who are at university and who want to do, you know, who only have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of space, so just want to get what they need to get out of it. But at the same time, expecting emergent learning. So one of the really big things about Breath of the Wild is that people play it in ways that Nintendo didn't expect them to. They'll create a machine to launch themselves across the map out by tying objects together, and there is no way the designers intended for that to happen, but they produced a system where it could happen and where it was kind of encouraged and rewarded. So that's emergent play, and what we're thinking about is emergent learning. So we like to be surprised when students create ways of learning within the Rise infrastructure. And at the bottom line is also we have to acknowledge that all of this might be difficult for students and might be alienating. And so at the heart of everything we're doing, we always go back to making it as accessible and as easy for students to get into and not fall back out of as possible. So we've got our lovely map here, which is kind of a lot of our metaphors that are stolen from Breath of the Wild. We don't really use this language when we're student facing because we think there's too many layers of metaphor to explain, but this is kind of our design language that then gets translated into activities for students. And all of these are stolen from Breath of the Wild to a certain extent. So for instance, towers in the game are the way in which you navigate the landscape and understand the lay of the land around you. So you climb up to a high spot and you can look around and you can fill up your map with all the things that are around you and that you might want to do. And that's a really common feature in open world games, and often open world games are actually a little bit criticized for just too many. It's just towers. That's all they are. In Breath of the Wild, towers are a challenge in their own right. So they require you to actually do something to get up them. They require you often to think a bit laterally about getting up them. And also they provide a bit of safety on the map. So what we've decided, what towers basically become are kind of multi-function kind of areas in the map that you're always aiming towards a tower. Basically, there's always something to do, and that's go and find the next tower. From the point of view of Rise, what we're looking for are experiences where students can see on the horizon, I want to go and do that thing, and that becomes a tower to us. So if they know that there's something on the horizon, that almost provides their next thing to do. I finished an activity, what do I do next? Let's look around. Oh, there's a tower over there. So what we try and do is flag up activities so that when a student has completed something, there's always something on the horizon for them to do next. But that in itself, when they get to the top of that thing, when they complete that thing, they can then see what the next thing is after that. And it provides there's an element of reflection in there. There's an element of them being able to take stock and think about what they want to do next. But at the end of the challenge, it basically allows them to sorry, I've lost my train of thought here. It basically allows them to chain together these things so they can get a lay of the land and see what's going on. Mark, I don't know if you had any more reflections on the tower metaphor.
Yeah, just the other side. When you're not up a tower, you're on a landscape where a tower is very visible. So if you are lost, it gives you an immediate navigable feature.
Yeah, there's always, I mean, that's the thing, there's always somewhere to go next, and the towers are the thing to aim for. And then the kind of extended metaphor is we start thinking about summits as well. I mean, this is a little bit of a weird one because we actually have things called summits that aren't quite this function, but a summit is basically a tower. I mean, a tower is something that you do on your own, effectively. If you, as an individual learner, you might identify that you want to do something. A summit is a big tower for groups of people, so it becomes a bigger challenge that everyone is aiming towards. So if there's in Breath of the Wild, often if you see a high point, you want to go to it, and if there's a mountain on the horizon, the first thing you want to do as a player is get to the top of that mountain. What summits are doing as part of Rise is providing a focal point for all learners to aim towards. And again, they're really challenging to get up. They might require planning. It might require you to learn some skills to get to the top of that summit. You have to plan your engagement with it, but when you get to the top, it's a real achievement, and often it's an achievement that involves other people and that kind of thing. So as we work towards developing Rise activities, what we're really trying to do is create things that require other people and that can't be tackled alone, and encourage that kind of collective effort towards an end goal. Yeah, but again, they're always there and they're always present, and you can always see them on the horizon. So we're constantly showing students you could be doing this, but maybe it's something to work towards by working through another few things first. Yeah. Sorry, just gaining control of my computer again. And villages are kind of the opposite. So villages are safe spaces. Within the game, villages are where you go to kind of rest and recuperate and are a kind of welcoming place. And we realized that actually you need social spaces within that too. So within the open world of Rise, we need some things where there are low stakes engagement and low stakes activities where you can just come along and meet other people and socialize, and without the kind of a project or a challenge or work hanging over you. And it also might be a space where students can kind of come back to having completed a challenge and celebrate what they've done. So we're thinking about where students exhibit their work, where students share their work with each other, where students get feedback from each other. All of those things need to be built into activities. So you're not just doing the challenge and leaving students at the end of it. You're providing them with something else to do, but also pulling them back and saying, and here's a safe space where you can actually think about what you want to do next and reflect. That's been a tricky one for us, obviously working online. And I think we're increasingly trying to build that into even online activities where there's a space where students can engage in some of that more low stakes social stuff that within a conventional HE journey that isn't kind of pandemic affected. That might be a conversation in the atrium of the business school, or going for a coffee in between lectures or something like that.
We had some really nice examples during the pandemic of low stakes makey type sessions. So there was one, for instance, which was an introduction to code, but what they did was they coded a snowflake. It was a pre-Christmas activity, and the actual setup for that is really simple. And then a lot of it is just sat in a room nattering while you're coding and showing the thing that you've made. And I think that kind of emulates this kind of low stakes sociable experience.
Yeah. Within the game, there are things called shrines, and shrines are basically there are hundreds of them in the game to be discovered, and they're basically little miniature challenge dungeons, a puzzle to complete. They exist separately from the world. So this image, basically, the player character goes into this little doorway and disappears off the main map and into a shrine where there is a job, a particular skill to do. And we realised that actually that sometimes that removing yourself from the map to do something else is often a really useful thing. The form it takes in Rise is we have self-study packs. So a student can identify that they want to do something that isn't an applied challenge. They just want to learn some code, or they want to learn some of this language, or they want to learn something about mental health. what our self-study packs do is they remove learners from the kind of wider journey, allow them to take stock and just learn that one skill in its own right, which they can then bring and pull back out into the kind of real world of the Rise journey, the open world of the Rise journey. So often what happens within a shrine is still experiential and is still kind of applied, but it's separated from everything else. And it just allows students to focus on one thing rather than thinking about the whole landscape in one go. It might be a standalone workshop, it might be a self-study pack, but the most important thing about a shrine is that it's about the skill rather than the context, and then the context comes back in when they have completed that little mini challenge. The big one for us, and this is the one that we spent a lot of time thinking about, is the plateau. So within Breath of the Wild, this is where you start the game, and it's basically a miniature open world within the open world. It's a self-contained space that allows the player to experiment, and they're not allowed to. They can leave whenever they want, effectively, but they're not really given the effective tools to leave until they've completed some little tutorial challenges and structured versions of other. So all of the other things, the shrines and the towers and the summits and the village, all exist on the plateau in miniature form. And the player can engage with all of those, and in doing so, get the toolkit to leave the plateau and go and explore the open world itself. I mean, I've got a picture. So this little bit circled in pink on the map is the plateau. So that's where you start the game, and that already feels big when you start. And there's 4 or 5 different shrines and some dungeons and some towers on there. But you can see within the scale of the actual world itself, it's absolutely minuscule. But what it does is, by providing a little open world within an open world, it provides a little space to experiment and start off before you're completely overwhelmed and alienated by this massive world to explore. Within Rise, what that basically means is, in the first term, we have a plateau. We provide all of the things like shrines and towers and event and all our little things, but we do it within a smaller structure that's more self-contained and more managed, so that students can experience and experiment with our platform and experiment with our ways of doing things. And then once they're happy to remove the training wheels or to, grab their parachute and jump off the plateau, they can do it. But it was very clear early on that we couldn't just dump them in this open world and just let them run free. We had to have some sort of tutorial there, and that's kind of how we do it. And even within the plateau, we have a miniature version of a miniature tutorial at the very start of that as well. So you're kind of constantly expanding the horizons of what learners do with their activities, so that choice and that autonomy is less and less constrained over time until they feel much more comfortable doing their own thing, basically. Yeah. I think that's the last of our metaphors. Mark, have you got any more thoughts on the kind of metaphorical stuff?
No, I think you've covered everything.
Cool. So that's kind of where we're at with our thinking, and like I said, we use those principles and those ideas to kind of drive a lot of what we're doing in terms of the design of Rise, and it's still an ongoing thing, and there's still things that we want. But what we found is that once we realized that's what we were doing, because it almost started subconsciously us thinking about Breath of the Wild, and when we realized, oh, actually we're just ripping off Nintendo here, aren't we? Let's actually think more seriously about this. Once we started thinking about that metaphor, it actually became really productive to then feed it back into our own design thinking and that kind of thing. So the more we think about learners as players, there's more things we can do. So I think we can get deeper into play styles and personas, and we already do this to some extent. We have some students who engage with Rise and who do every activity we offer to them. We have some students who engage with exactly the one thing that they want to do. We have some who dabble. We have some who disappear for months at a time and then come back. We have some who kind of, who are only in it for the credit. We have some who are only in it for the experience. But the more you can get into what motivates different people to do different things, I think that the more you can understand how you can design for them. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that the students are increasingly telling stories about their Rise experiences that are similar to the stories that you hear online about people who play open world games. Oh, I went over here and found this. I went and found this secret object over here, and I followed this pathway to get there. That going back to this idea about we do have Rise speedrunners, yes, we do. That goes back to the stuff we were talking about at the very beginning about learning journeys usually involving some agency and being able to tell the beginning, middle, and end of your story on that journey. What we're finding is that by providing students with things to tell a story about, you then get into them being able to tell a story, understand their own learning differently, sell that to employers, etc. One thing I've been tackling is what the boss is in Rise. We don't really have an end boss. There is an end boss in Breath of the Wild. You can literally run straight to the end boss and try and take him on at the very beginning of the game, and you probably won't do very well, but you can do that. We don't have a boss in Rise just yet, or maybe we do and we haven't identified it yet, but I'm wondering what that is. The other thing this has done is actually got us thinking about ourselves as designers. So one thing that we'd like to get more in there is co-design and modding and making the space hackable. So now we've got an open world, what can we do so that players can change that open world once we started curating it? So building community, putting the tools in place so that students don't just journey through the landscape, but actively change the landscape. And then there's also this idea about that I'm playing with the design as a landscape as well. This has been kind of thinking out loud, but we definitely haven't. We've been on a journey ourselves in designing this. We haven't gone in a straight line, and we haven't. As much as we had a target for what Rise was going to do, it's gone in such weird and wonderful directions that I'm wondering if we're also traveling through a landscape as we design it too. So yeah, going back to the metaphor, I think what we're trying to do is understand the learning journey differently and in a way that students are more aware they're on a journey rather than just thinking about the beginning and the end, which is often how that metaphor works. And I'm wondering if we need to kind of reclaim that idea about landscape, have a more kind of ecological understanding of all of the different things that contribute to a learning journey and the things that are happening around it as well as along it. Yeah. Any more reflective thoughts, Mark? I'm just.
Yeah. It's all. Oh, John, I'm getting feedback off yours. Could you just? Yeah. The final reflection that I'm kind of I'm engaged with a senior kind of leadership role in relation to it is that this landscape doesn't sit isolated from the other educational landscapes that students journey. And I think there's something for us to explore about the intersections between, a formal course landscape and the open space that we're creating, whether they are isolated kind of experiences or where there are portals and points of interaction and porousness between them. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think it sets up another layer of tensions in how students receive and experience what we do and then what courses do as well. Hope you're still on mute. Sorry, John, that's my fault.
I think that's the end of us, so I'm going to stop presenting there and so everyone can see us again. But yeah, that's where we're at. We're very happy to take questions or to open discussion up. Yeah.
I like Erica's idea. So task where you as a learner are restricted any tools, items, software you use.
Yeah. That is my favourite bit of Breath of the Wild, actually. Eventide Island, it's great.
I'm not up to that because I'm playing with a 6-year-old, which means I'm just about off the Great Plateau. I mean, I think that kind of exercise would be a really good plateau type exercise, actually, as something that you give them in the induction to Rise, which is about that feeling of alienness and unfamiliarity. Paul's got his hand up.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Can I ask a question? I'd like to ask a question that goes right to the beginning of the talk, where you sort of introduce Rise in the context of the educational journey that people have been on, and the kind of on rails nature of that then we maybe replicate in higher education, and you've got this kind of open world approach that clearly is aiming to sort of disrupt that sort of rail-like journey, maybe, or might do. I wondered how Rise, and maybe I should know this because I do work at Manchester Met, but how Rise is, what's the impact beyond the individual students having a great time, getting Rise points, and getting these wonderful experiences? Is it having an impact on the way they approach their learning? Is there any kind of evidence of that, or on the way in which the university is prepared to deliver material to its students outside of Rise within departments? So two questions, I suppose, about the impact of RISE to date.
Yeah, so we did a comparison of RISE engaged students and non-RISE engaged students around some of the hard metrics that I'm held account for. So we have a lot of fun, and I'm under a lot of pressure with very definite targets and outcomes. So graduate outcomes is my big one. It'll be a long time before we see the volume of students through into the graduate prospects survey to be able to do that. But we do a yearly career readiness survey where we ask students, how are you making progress towards the career you want? We saw a 6 percentage point average increase rise engaged students, which is very tangible. We also saw quite a significant increase in the award outcomes. So there was something like 8% more likely to graduate with good honours, which is fine. And some of that is the extra credits they get. But the bit that was really interesting to me is they were also more likely to increase their performance in all of the units. And they were far less likely to withdraw, suspend, or fail, to the point that, the first year we saw none of that. And I think some of that is actually an accidental thing, which is about social integration. So one of the things that this space creates, it does all those things we want it to do in terms of career, but also what it does is it creates a space where students are more likely to interact with each other, and they're more likely to be knitted into the communities of the university. And what was really interested in is we see the biggest group of students who engage are our most engaged students. That's obvious. The second biggest group is our least engaged students. And they're often doing it because it's a different way of playing university, and they can reset it. And it's not that community they've become alienated from and never made any friends with. It's a new one. So I think some of that is in there. Is that kind of answering your first question?
Yeah, it is, and it sounds very, very positive, particularly the idea of the students who may have manifested as being less engaged. The opportunity to re-engage somewhere else is really, really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, and not how you get to play university. In terms of the influence on university policy, so I think there's a risk that RISE does it so nobody else has to. There's also an opportunity, and one of the things that we have been really keen to do this year and we'll carry on to do is open the space up. So how do we enable practitioners, teachers, educators to use RISE as a wildcard space to do the things they want to do and that they know have value to students? And I think we're getting some traction in the value of that, because what it gives us is a rapid prototyping space. Universities move slowly. It takes us at least 3 years to do anything because we have a validation cycle with a set of material information associated with it. So you can't actually do it until it's out of date. What I think RISE has the potential to do is, okay, let's just do it quick. If it's great, let's bake it back down into a program and do more of that. And if it's not great, that's fine. It's in an experimental space, which students are very tolerant for, and therefore we can do that quick failure within it. The work that I'm doing now is how do we get that aligned with things like promotions and recognition processes, that you're a really good educator, this is a space for autonomy, and it is then recognized that contribution is there. So it's slow motion because we're a big institution, but I think there are opportunities, and I think there's openness that we can do that.
And I think, given, even if we are the space where this kind of thing happens, and there's always going to be that tension between what students are, the more directed activities students are doing on their courses and the freer activities, that tension is what we want them to play with. Like our reflective accounts are often about students having never done anything like this before, but if they did everything like this before, then they wouldn't be able to reflect in the same way, I suppose. So I think the distinction between the two experiences has some power to it too.
I'm interested in the chat there. So Charlotte's talked about glitches. I think it points to a space we need to pay more attention to. So glitches, hacks, cheating, these are all in the hygiene of gaming, aren't they? Mm. And I am sure, therefore, they occur in what we do. For all we say that there's an open set of possibilities here. I'm sure we also edit out some things as legitimate and other things as illegitimate. And I think there's probably more work we can do to throw light on those as actually interesting learning hygienes, as well as not expected ones.
Well, that goes back to some of the work I was doing in my PhD about like what you do about the students who understood the rules so effectively that they know how to break them. I mean, learning how to hack a game requires an awful lot of skill, you know. And in the same way, part of me would want to find a way of rewarding students for breaking Rise if they manage to do it. But I also would rather it wasn't broken because it's very precarious and fragile, you know.
What John's actually riffing on there is it's all held together with my dodgy code. Good. I think we might have exhausted questions unless anyone has anything else. I don't think I've missed anything in the show. Gemma's got a question about museum gallery approaches. No, I don't. John, do you want to?
No, I don't know either. Sorry.
Yeah, something not related to that. So there's something about informal learning and spaces and openness for pedagogy. One of the things that we're playing with is whether we can open up lots of our infrastructure as a public engagement program, which kind of creates a new dimension to what we do. I don't know about other places like that. I suspect that museums, galleries don't have the resource overhead necessarily to be able to do it. You need to collaborate across a network, but it would certainly have a really interesting set of possibilities, I think, because you do curate your own journey through a museum gallery, don't you? You're doing that anyway, kind of. Okay.
Nice one.
I think we're done.